I'm an engineer, and as you can tell from this coverage, I'm definitely not a PR person. And so since you're focused on the one test, let's talk about why we're doing that.
And by the way, it's not just me that was focused on the one test. The Theranos story was all about this one pinprick.
Right? This has nothing to do with our tests.
Now you're confusing me. How many tests are you doing right now?
Elizabeth Holmes was the chief executive of a health technology company. Holmes claimed that the company was able to run comprehensive lab tests from small volumes of blood, such as from a pinprick. This claim is the main topic in Fortune magazine's interview with Holmes. It's this interview I'll analyze according to the principles of two linguistic methods. Overall, these methods are concerned with how subjects phrase sentences, and oftentimes how they don't phrase sentences. Which words do they choose, and which words do they avoid? In the description to this video, you can find a short description about these detail-oriented methods. I'll focus on unreliable statements and deceptive strategies. If you like this video, please hit the like button. It helps me out a lot when you do that. Also, what do you notice about Holmes's behavior? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for being here. I hope you enjoy.
Fortune went all in on the Theranos story. I mean, the notion that with a single pinprick you could get blood and do many dozens of blood tests at one time at a much lower cost. So it was kind of a shock to us to discover a few weeks ago that you're really only doing one test with that pinprick. Do you think the hype, did we both let the hype get ahead of the story if you're only doing one test?
Well, let me just start by saying, and I'll talk about that decision to transition our systems to the FDA framework, which led us right now, as of this moment, and for the last few weeks only, to run just one test in a minute. But I think,
with her words, let me just start by saying, she initially lets the interviewer know that she's not about to answer directly. Hence, she engages in a roundabout answer. This is a so-called overt practice roundabout answer. This means acknowledging or pretending to acknowledge the interviewer's question and letting him know that she'll provide an answer eventually. However, during the interview it becomes clear that she's being evasive, because she doesn't always give fitting answers. Far from it. Evasive answers belong in the category of covert practice. Reliable language characterized by fluency as a main category. Instead of pausing and making self-repairs, the subject speaking more or less directly. Self-repairs are self-initiated interruptions of self-initiated utterances. Being direct shows us that what they're saying isn't sensitive to them. When I say isn't sensitive, I mean not showing signs of withholding information. Let's keep fluency in mind as we continue to listen to her answer.
part of this is we've looked at all of these articles over the course of the last couple weeks, and I'm an engineer, and we've tried to approach this the way we approach everything, which is understanding, what was written, what's accurate, what's not accurate, and how did it happen. And so we went through these in detail, and we've seen that much of what has been written is not accurate. And so we've asked ourselves, what did we do to get into this kind of place in which we're reading this kind of stuff all over the national media? And what we've concluded from that is that we need to do a better job of communicating, and we want to be the best at that. I mean, as you can tell from this coverage, I'm definitely not a PR person. And so, we need to get that out there. And part of that was that, we have not put into the public domain much of our technology and operations historically. We've talked about our work that we're doing on the policy front in the context of prevention and early detection, but we haven't talked about our devices and the fact we've developed hundreds of assets.
I'll start out with brief explanations of three concepts in this transcript. The colons indicate vowel lengthening, The dots between parentheses are called micropauses, pauses under 2 seconds. The highlighted interjections are hesitation markers. All 3 concepts point to hesitation. Hesitation is an indicator that what the subject's saying is highly sensitive to them, and also that they're intentionally prolonging the answer. This gives them more time to try and dominate the conversation. Vowel lengthening, micropauses, and interjections are all opposed to fluency. This means that we're dealing with a subject who's very much self-aware about what she's saying and could potentially be performing or acting. We can locate this self-awareness or performance in her appeal to ethos, which means competence and credibility. She uses the personal pronoun I, but then shifts to the collective personal pronoun we in the same sentence and for the rest of her answer, with one exception. This is called an institutional we, one person speaking on behalf of the company, and it's also association. Most often, association works like a light switch. The subject shifts from I to we and vice versa when it's convenient. So, with the pronoun I, it's important to her to emphasize her supposed personal skills, being an engineer. However, it's convenient for her to shift to we when she mentions the critical questions they allegedly ask themselves. She doesn't say, "What did I do to get into this kind of place?" but "What did we do to get into this kind of place?" Linguistically, this is shared responsibility. Communication is the syntactic focus in her lengthy answer. Her prolonged and repetitious utterances have built up to this focus. Associated with this concept is the concept of unreliable self-criticism. Deceptive people, like Holmes, avoid criticizing themselves unless it has a self-beneficial purpose. Acting humble and apologetic resonates with some viewers and can generate a certain level of sympathy. I'll argue that this is what Holmes is doing here, especially considering the fact that lack of communication functions as her main excuse. We then get the second instance of the pronoun I when she says that she's definitely not a PR person. In political rhetoric, the entirety of her answer is called the positive resistance dimension. This is where the subject resists the implications of the interviewer's question. In doing so, the subject modifies the question in order to provide much more information than the question called for. The positive resistance dimension is part of the larger rhetorical concepts, agenda setting, and framing. The interviewer then says he thinks Holmes is an extraordinary communicator. In most interactions, his assertion would have a comforting function. Here, however, it debunks her excuse.
And I want to come back to that about putting the data and the information out in the public domain so people can really see what you're doing. But let's stick with the communications thing for a second, because I actually think you are an extraordinary communicator. And I want to show a clip we have from the TED talk that you did, I don't know, 9 months ago? Yeah. Let's just take a look at this clip and then talk about it. Could we play the clip, please?
We've made it possible to run comprehensive laboratory tests from a tiny sample or a few drops of blood that could be taken from a finger. And we've made it possible to eliminate the tubes and tubes of blood that traditionally have to be drawn from an arm and replaced it with the nanotainer.
As we learn from this TED Talk excerpt, Holmes is indeed performing. Her body language and speech pattern are highly controlled and deliberate. This seems to contradict that she's definitely not a PR person, as she claimed. Still, she insists on the excuse, lack of communication. Let's have a listen.
So we have made it possible to do comprehensive lab tests from a prick from the finger and to eliminate the tubes and tubes of blood.
Yeah.
In retrospect, when you look at where you are today, one test with the prick of blood, wasn't that going too far?
So we have developed hundreds of tests over the course of the last 12 years that can run a tiny sample using proprietary Theranos technology. And part of when I talk about communicating, what we need to do is we need to get that data out there. And I've talked publicly over the course of the last couple of weeks that we've made a decision now to take the data that we've generated for our FDA submissions and put it into the public domain, and we will. But since you're focused on the one test, let's talk about why we're doing that.
She obviously doesn't want to talk about the one test she was asked about. By means of covert practice, she modifies the question. She says, run a tiny sample. Tiny sample isn't the same as one test. And she herself distinguishes between this tiny sample and the one test by mentioning one test in this contrasting clause. She says, let's talk about why we're doing that. If she really wanted to talk about this one test, she could have done so initially. Instead, she doesn't mention the test until much later. This reveals that the preceding utterances are attempts to postpone the talk about the one test. There's also a hint of criticism of the interviewer in her words, but since you're focused on the one test, she doesn't want him to focus on the one test because she doesn't want it to be the focus. Therefore, her final words, let's talk about why we're doing that, fall flat, even though she tries to align with the interviewer with the contraction let's, because all her preceding utterances have shown that she doesn't want to talk about it. Next, the interviewer responds to her critique.
I have...
Well, and by the way, it's not just me that was focused on the one test. That was sort of the story. The Theranos story was all about this one pinprick that would let you do comprehensive blood testing.
Yeah.
That was the story.
Yeah, well, I think this is what we sort of need to dissect a little bit. So when you look at Theranos, Theranos makes devices, we make chemistries, we make consumables, we make software, and we have a little tube called a nanotainer, which we use to collect our blood. We went in 2013 to the FDA and we said, we want to be the company that works on building a model for taking all of this technology that's developed under the lab framework through the FDA framework. And we believe in it so strongly because we believe in an individual's right to access their own data. And so we have been, and we've been working on that for 2 years now. What happened in the last few weeks is that we decided that we would take just the tube, not the tests, not the devices, not the chemistry, and cut it over to the FDA quality system, which meant that temporarily, as we transition, which has now been just a few weeks, we would not be using that tube to collect our samples, right?
Well is a discourse marker, often used to politely initiate disagreement, but disagreement nonetheless. The politeness continues with her use of hedges, I think, and sort of, and also her alignment with the interviewer with the collective pronoun we, as if this is a shared dissection. She tries to be as humble as she can be. Next, she provides a lengthy narrative with direct quotes of what her company allegedly said to the FDA. Again, her answer comes across as stalling, a drawn-out narrative which contains virtue signaling, in lack of a better term. She tries to make it about the individual's right to access. This is going to be a recurring appeal to the audience in her statements. Her closing, right, has an inbuilt preference for agreement. It's not an actual question, it's merely checking for agreement. It has the same function in the following excerpt.
This has nothing to do with our tests.
Now you're confusing me. How many tests are you doing right now from a simple pinprick as you described in that TED Talk?
Yeah, so right now, just because of this FDA transition, we're only doing one, right?
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that we don't have the technology to do them or that we haven't done them in the past.
What follows, the conjunction but, has the syntactic focus in a sentence and minimizes the preceding sentence. So, along with the time restriction right now, we learn that it's sensitive to her to immediately contrast her admission with the positive claim that they have the technology. It's taken her a long time to admit that they're only doing one test.
And are you confident that you will get the FDA approval to do the 200 that are a standard part of the draw?
Well, there's multiple parts to this. One is the validation of those tests under the lab framework. The other one is the FDA submission, and this is an area of evolving policy that we're working to create a leadership position in. We've never talked publicly about what the status of what we're doing with FDA is, because we just hadn't felt that was appropriate until we got into all of this recent press communications. But we're incredibly confident in the data that we've submitted to the agency. We've worked on it for 2 years.
She starts with a self-repair, indicating a problem source, the problem source being the interviewer's question. She again chooses to start with so. So indicates that the speaker's invested in the conversation and has an answer at hand, even when this isn't the case. She could have just said the final sentences, because these contain the direct answer to the interviewer's question. The fact that she doesn't means there are reasons for her giving a roundabout answer instead, and we observe the same patterns as in her previous answers. Firstly, she appeals to her company's ethos, and with the participle working, she suggests that working to create a leadership position is an ongoing process, not a completed one. This gives her leeway. Secondly, she again repeats the excuse about communication, even though communication has very little or nothing to do with the question. Next, when she's asked what she's learned, she's also quick to highlight the company's alleged ethos and lack of communication. More and more, these two areas are revealed for what they are, a pre-planned agenda. It's like a politician who returns to the same words and concepts, irrespective of the question he or she is asked. Listen to this.
What have you learned in the process? I mean, you started this at a very young age. You were only 19 years old. There's no reason why you should know what it's like to run a $9 billion company or deal with this kind of a press attack. But what are the most important lessons you've taken away from this?
I've learned the point about communication. Yeah, I think that we, as a technology company, I spent 10 years working with a team of engineers and scientists. We have a huge number of PhDs in our company to develop these hundreds of assays, and we never talked to the press once, right? I mean, we barely had a website.
We should note the definite article, when she says the point about communication. She's aware that she's referring back to the most prominent element in her pre-planned defense tactics. In the following, we note how she again applies virtue signaling as she tries to deflect the interviewer's objection that she has in fact talked. At this point, her arguments follow a predictable pattern.
But you talked.
Not for 10 years. The first time we ever were in the press, ever, in terms of communicating externally, was in the fall of 2013, when we began to launch our consumer retail infrastructure. And the reason that we did it then is because so much of what I want my life's work to be about is empowering and enfranchising people with the right and access to their own health information. Our company is actually not just about a pinprick, it's about access, and it's about the ability for people to afford care and to get convenient care and to get early detection. And that means low prices, it means convenient locations. But what we've seen in this is that we never talked about the technology and operations on the back end because we were so focused on our intellectual property. And what we want to do with this now is introduce that to the world so that people can see what we've built.
She says our company is actually not just about a pinprick. The adverb actually is used to compare two different thoughts. Here she compares the interviewer's focus on the pinprick to what she wants to be the focus: access and the ability of people to afford care. In political communication, it's a common rhetorical device to refer to a greater good in order to gain people's sympathy, and this is what Holmes is doing. The statement is an indirect refutation and perhaps even ridicule of the interviewer's focus on the pinprick. Once more, she makes the conversation about lack of communication, but she still manages to sneak in a subtle self-praise, saying they were so focused on their intellectual property.
One of the things you've seen in the last few weeks that a lot of medical experts have come out expressing skepticism about your technology, in part because they don't see peer-reviewed research, they don't have access to your data. So you think in retrospect you should have been more transparent?
I think right now we want to try to lead in transparency. I mean, I made a call that if we would be the first lab with the confidence to submit our test to FDA, that would be the way to get the data out. But there's no reason we can't do peer review, and there's no reason we can't publish other stats, and we're going to do that.
Instead of answering the question about whether or not this should have been more transparent, she deflects and makes it about the present instead, that right now they want to try to lead in transparency. The verb try gives a leeway to not lead in transparency. The verb lead in this context is identical to her previous statements that they want to have a leadership position. It's important to her to emphasize their level of ambition, and more importantly, that it's a process, that the world hasn't seen the final result yet. Highlighting that this is a process has a self-protective function. With the words, with the confidence, we again observe self-praise, that it's a brave thing she's done, apparently. She's reframing, trying to make something negative sound positive. Her formulations, there's no reason we can't do peer review, and there's no reason we can't publish other stats, are worth noting. They're stated in the negative, which suggests that the opposite thoughts on her mind. To find a reason not to do peer reviews and not to publish stats. Hence, these negative formulations weaken her subsequent promise, we're gonna do that, where she again points to a process for self-protective and thus self-serving reasons. Elizabeth Holmes struggles a lot to not say a whole lot. See you in the next video.